Welcome back to these series of lectures. It's the second half of Western Civ. We're going to talk about the Russian Revolution for the next few lectures. We'll introduce it here. I've broken this lecture down into various parts because of the length of time involved here and the complexity. And you could make the argument that there's actually more than one Russian Revolution. I've organized this lecture with a theatrical metaphor, a dress rehearsal, and then a second dress rehearsal, and then the main event, which of course is the Bolshevik Revolution in 1918, and then we'll have an encore, which is the Stalin's collectivization of agriculture in the late 20s and early 30s. So let's start with context first. I suppose the most obvious context is the Great War. The Russian Revolution takes place during the World War I. A second context that's probably worth keeping in mind is that Russia is a country under great stress and almost continually at war, either with external enemies or at civil war with itself, over this period at the beginning of the 20th century. There's also another context here, and that's this ideological struggle that is an ongoing ideological struggle between communism and capitalism, and we're going to see it come to its fruition here in the Bolshevik Revolution. Significance? Well, we're going to see established the first communist state. So let's start with our dress rehearsal, the Revolution of 1905. Let's try to characterize Russia a bit. Remember that 95% of Russia's people are peasant farmers, about 165 million at this point. The elites live in the various cities in Western Russia: St. Petersburg, Kiev, Smolensk, Moscow, Odessa. Remember, in an earlier lecture on Russia, we talked about the traditional fear of the peasants by the urban elite and by the urban populations, who regard peasants as barbarians, happy to starve the city people to death. Peasants are viewed as impediments to progress and to culture and modernization. Let's continue with our dress rehearsal and just make a couple of remarks here about Tsar Nicholas II. We talked about Nicky, of course, and when we talked about the Great War and its origins. A man of poor judgment, weak character. His diary portrays how should we put it, a triviality of mind. His rule, of course, is through spies and police, oppression, domestic terror. I was trying to think of positive attributes for Nicholas II. I suppose his continued support of the Trans-Siberian Railroad is a positive or a plus on his resume. We continue with the dress rehearsal by talking about the war with Japan in the early 20th century. Japanese and Russian interests are clashing in East Asia and Manchuria and along the Pacific Rim there. And war will ensue between the Japanese and the Russians. Now, the problem, of course, is that the Russian fleet is based in the Baltic, on the other side of the world. This fleet will have to make a long and time-consuming and expensive journey from the Baltic all the way to the Straits of Korea. When it arrives there in February of 1904, the Japanese Navy promptly ambushes the Russian Navy, and Russia loses this war in the most humiliating fashion. Some historians have put forward the idea that this war with Japan was designed in part to distract the Russian people from domestic problems at home, to neutralize this budding revolutionary movements in Russia. I want to recommend a classic film to you. It's called The Battleship Potemkin. This, of course, is Sergei Eisenstein's classic silent film. I think it was made in 1925, and it depicts events of this incipient sort of Russian revolution as a result of the loss of the war to Japan. Let's continue with the dress rehearsal. The Tsar makes concessions in his weakness after this loss to Japan. This defeat sets off widespread revolt in the country. In January of 2005, the Tsarist troops fire on a crowd in St. Petersburg, killing a large number. This is known as Bloody Sunday. The workers march on the Tsar's Winter Palace. They want a popular assembly. And of course, the Tsar is the head of an autocratic government. All the power lies in his hands. There are strikes, peasants ransacking the landlord's estates, students are demonstrating. The country's in chaos. So under this pressure, Tsar Nicholas permits the first parliamentary institution in Russian history, the Duma, D-U-M-A. Now, this Duma lacks the power to create or to dissolve the Tsarist government, and the Tsar will increasingly chip away at the Duma's power and restores his own strength through continued repression, spies and police, and exiling domestic troublemakers. Now, second, dress rehearsal. The Revolution of February 1917. And again, we're right in the middle of the Great War. The Russian military effort has failed. We have these previous Russian defeats in the war with Japan that we just talked about. And then a half century before that, you have the Russian defeats in the Crimean War. So you have this emerging tradition of Russian weakness in battle. And I think this is lingering in the minds of many people. Of course, you also have the Russian notion of Pan-Slavism, which we talked about as one of the long-term causes of the Great War. This notion that Russia, being the greatest of the Slavic-speaking peoples, is obligated to protect her little Slavic brothers. You'll remember Serbia in this case. Here we are in the middle of the Great War. The German armies are deep inside of Russia. They've occupied the whole western portion of the Russian frontier. You may remember the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, whereby Lenin signs away the whole western Russian frontier to the Germans in exchange for peace. You may remember that Russian soldiers are so poorly equipped and fed and supplied by their own government that quite often Russian soldiers get their supplies from dead Germans in the battlefield in front of them. Sources of discontent, well, the economy is in ruins. What heavy industry Russia had has been destroyed or occupied by the Germans. Refugees and soldiers are now flooding into the cities, fleeing the battlefield. And of course, famine results. We don't have the adequate number of people in the villages to bring in the harvest. And we have increasing numbers of urban population because of, again, the refugees and soldiers fleeing the front. The army's voting with its feet by 1917. Russian soldiers are throwing their weapons down and turning east, going home. Tremendous casualties. I've read that Russia mobilized over 10 million troops in World War I, and their casualty rates are extraordinarily high. So these disasters are going to bring the Tsar and the church, the traditional sources of authority in Russia. These are going to be diminished, and they're going to lose their legitimacy in the eyes of the Russian people. Tsar Nicholas will abdicate his throne. That is, he walks away. Probably the most sensible thing he could do, considering the collapse of the war effort and the discontent domestically. Again, soldiers are in search of food, not the enemy. Paper money's worthless. Inflation is rampant. And even if the money was worth something, there's nothing to buy. My statistics say the cost of living increase since 1914, when the war started, had gone up to 300%. So the paper in your pocket is just that, it's paper. Loss of confidence in Nicholas II, food riots. Now in St. Petersburg or Petrograd, Soviets began forming. Soviets are urban workers organizing themselves, not just for economic power, but for political power as well. And Nicholas will resign his office in February 1917. Now, what emerges here is the Kerensky government. It's called the Provisional Government. It's kind of a dual power situation here with the Petrograd Soviet and the Duma, which is dominated by parties on the left. The Duma passes popular reforms. It disbands the Tsarist police, widely hated throughout the country. The Duma repeals all limitations on freedom of speech and press and association. Again, these are revolutionary moves. The Duma abolished laws that discriminated against ethnic and religious groups, ended the death penalty for desertion. So we throw a bone to the army here, or to the soldiers. The Duma does not, and Kerensky's provisional government does not, end the war. Russia continues to fight. Nor does it satisfy the peasantry's demands for land reform. So, by the summer of 1917, we still have Russia in a chaotic situation, a fluid situation, with this provisional government attempting to continue the war, while at the same time attempting to create reform within the country. This, of course, will lead us to the main event, which is the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917. And we'll talk about that next time. Thank you.